Imagine a moment in your life when everything seems to be falling apart, where the weight of difficulties becomes almost unbearable. It is in this scenario that we find the story of a man whose life was marked by suffering and abandonment. However, before we delve into his journey of turnaround and redemption, let us reflect on a powerful promise that echoes through the ages, directly from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, verses 1 to 14. And it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth. These words, as ancient as they are eternal, bring with them the promise of unparalleled blessings for those who choose to listen and obey God's commandments. It is under this divine light that our story begins. We meet a man who, at the peak of his despair, finds himself lost, without direction. He was abandoned by those he loved and left to face the world alone. However, it is in this darkness that the seed of hope begins to germinate. For, just as the promise in Deuteronomy, even in the darkest hours, there is a light of hope waiting to shine. Let us embark together on this journey of transformation, where faith and obedience to divine commandments become the keys to a life of exaltation and blessing. This is just the beginning of a story that promises to inspire and bring a new perspective on the strength of God's promise in our lives. However, our protagonist's journey was just beginning. The initial adversities emerged relentlessly, like waves continuously crashing against a solitary rock in the middle of the ocean. Our man faced days of constant rejection. People he considered friends turned their backs on him, family members avoided him, and loneliness became his only faithful companion. Every door he tried to open seemed locked. Every attempt to find a job or support resulted in frustration and discouragement. The nights were long and silent, filled with dark thoughts and unanswered questions. "Why me?" he repeatedly asked himself, as the world around him seemed to continue indifferent to his suffering. He wandered the streets, feeling invisible and worthless, watching life go by while he remained stagnant. Memories of better times, when he had a home and love, only intensified the pain of the present. Loneliness became a prison, and despair a constant shadow. With each passing day, the flame of hope diminished a little more. He found himself at the lowest point of his existence, where the light of the promise in Deuteronomy seemed distant and unattainable. But even in the depths of despair, the seed of the promise was planted, waiting for the right moment to flourish. What he did not know yet was that these trials were the first steps of a profound transformation. God's promise, although silent, began to act in ways he could not see or understand at that moment. And so, in the midst of darkness, the stage was being set for something extraordinary. But when the darkness seemed most impenetrable, an unexpected ray of light appeared. During one of those long nights of insomnia, while wandering aimlessly through the city streets, he found an old park bench. Exhausted, he sat down, and there he found a pamphlet someone had left behind. On it were written words that seemed to speak directly to his heart. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight." These words brought a small spark of hope. He began to remember the lessons of his childhood, the stories of faith and God's promises. He decided, albeit reluctantly, to turn back to the faith he had once known. On a cold night under a starry sky, he knelt and, with tears in his eyes, offered a simple but sincere prayer. "God, if you are there, please help me." The answer did not come immediately, but something changed within him. A sense of peace began to emerge, small but noticeable. From that moment, he decided to listen to God's voice, even if it was a whisper amidst the chaos. He began attending a small local church, where he found people who welcomed him without judgment. It was in this environment that he began to feel God's presence in a way he had never experienced before. Each sermon, each hymn sung, seemed to carry a direct message for him. And so, the man who had lost everything began to find something more valuable than he could ever have imagined: renewed faith and a supportive community. He began to realize that by listening to the Lord's voice and following His commandments, he was planting the seeds for a transformation that would exceed his expectations. This small light in the darkness was the beginning of his journey of redemption and rebirth. He still faced challenges, but now he was no longer alone. The promise of Deuteronomy began to take shape in his life, and true change was on its way. The transformation began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Small acts of kindness from strangers, welcoming smiles at church, and a growing sense that he was on the right path. As the days passed, he found the strength to seek job opportunities again, but this time with a new perspective. Instead of discouragement, there was a quiet determination fueled by faith. It was then that an unexpected opportunity arose. One of the church members, a local businessman, needed help in his store. Although the work was humble, it was a chance to start over. With gratitude in his heart, he accepted the offer and began working with dedication and zeal. Each day of work was a step toward rebuilding his life. He learned new skills, made friends, and, most importantly, began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. The promise of Deuteronomy 28 verses 1 to 14 resonated in his mind. "If you hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, and observe to do all his commandments, the Lord thy God will set thee on high." These words became his daily mantra. With each task completed, each challenge overcome, he saw God's hand guiding his steps. Small miracles began to happen. The finances, which had once been a constant worry, started to stabilize. He found a small apartment to rent, a place he could call home. The transformation was not only external but also internal. The man who had once been broken and desperate now radiated new strength and hope. He dedicated himself to prayer and Bible study, seeking wisdom and understanding. Each day, he felt closer to God and more confident that he was on the right path. As the days passed, he found the strength to seek job opportunities again, but this time with a new perspective. Instead of discouragement, there was a quiet determination fueled by faith. It was then that an unexpected opportunity arose. One of the church members, a local businessman, needed help in his store. Although the work was humble, it was a chance to start over. With gratitude in his heart, he accepted the offer and began working with dedication and zeal. Each day of work was a step toward rebuilding his life. He learned new skills, made friends, and, most importantly, began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. The promise of Deuteronomy 28 verses 1 to 14 resonated in his mind. If you hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, and observe to do all his commandments, the Lord thy God will set thee on high." These words became his daily mantra. With each task completed, each challenge overcome, he saw God's hand guiding his steps. Small miracles began to happen. The finances, which had once been a constant worry, started to stabilize. He found a small apartment to rent, a place he could call home. The transformation was not only external but also internal. The man who had once been broken and desperate now radiated new strength and hope. He dedicated himself to prayer and Bible study, seeking wisdom and understanding. Each day, he felt closer to God and more confident that he was on the right path. And so, the light that had begun as a small spark in a moment of despair now shone brighter. He was living the promise of blessing, realizing that faithfulness and obedience to God's commandments brought rewards beyond the material, a peace and joy that transcended circumstances. The journey was not yet complete, but he was confident that with God by his side, he could face any challenge that came. The promise of exaltation and blessing was being fulfilled, step by step, and the true turnaround in his life was just beginning to unfold. As he continued on his path of faith and hard work, the man's personal and spiritual transformation intensified. He faced and overcame many obstacles, both internal and external. The ghosts of the past still tried to haunt him, but his renewed faith gave him the strength to move forward. Each challenge overcome served as a testament to God's power in his life. He began to realize that the divine commandments were not just rules but a guide to a full and meaningful life. His mornings began with prayer and Bible reading, seeking the wisdom that helped him face the day. His nights ended with gratitude, reflecting on the blessings received. At work, he stood out for his ethics, dedication, and kindness. His colleagues began to notice the change in him, and many were inspired by his story. He did not hesitate to share his testimony, talking about how faith and obedience to God transformed his life. His journey of overcoming became a beacon of hope for those around him. It was during this period that he began to feel a greater calling. In one of the church meetings, he heard a message about the power of serving others. The idea of helping other people who were facing difficulties similar to those he had faced in the past began to take shape in his heart. He decided to volunteer in support programs for homeless people, offering not only food and clothing but also words of encouragement and hope. Each smile he managed to elicit, each look of gratitude he received, reinforced his mission. He saw himself in the people he helped and felt God's presence in every act of kindness. The man who had once been abandoned and lost was now becoming a pillar of support and inspiration for many. He understood that his transformation was not just for his own benefit, but also to serve as an instrument of God's blessings in the lives of others. With each person he helped, he felt the promise of Deuteronomy 28 manifesting in deep and tangible ways. This phase of his life was marked by intense spiritual growth and a deeper connection with God. He was preparing, even without knowing it, for the moments of exaltation and recognition that were to come. The path of overcoming and faith was paved, and the man was ready for the new chapters that God had reserved for him. As he continued to serve and help others, something profound began to change within him. He found a new purpose in his life, a sense of mission that went beyond his own needs. This rebirth, both spiritual and emotional, brought a renewed sense of joy and peace. He realized that by helping others, he was also helping himself. Each act of kindness, each word of comfort, strengthened his own faith and resilience. He began to see his past experiences not as burdens but as valuable lessons that prepared him for this moment. His life, which had once seemed directionless, was now full of purpose and meaning. The man found purpose in his volunteer work, where he could share his testimony of overcoming with those still in the darkness. He became a mentor to many, offering advice, support, and, above all, hope. His life story inspired others to believe that transformation was possible, even in the most difficult circumstances. Furthermore, he dedicated himself to studying and understanding more deeply God's commandments and promises. Each verse read, each teaching absorbed, reinforced his determination to live a life that reflected divine principles. He not only listened to God's voice but also strove to live according to it daily. This period of rebirth also brought reconciliations. People who had previously abandoned him began to notice the change in his life and reapproached him. He forgave those who had hurt him, understanding that forgiveness was a crucial step in his own healing and spiritual growth. The new purpose in his life also manifested in practical ways. He began organizing community events, bringing resources and opportunities to those in need. His leadership abilities, previously unknown, blossomed. He was now seen as a pillar of the community, someone everyone could turn to for guidance and support. This rebirth and rediscovery of purpose confirmed for him that the promise of Deuteronomy 28 verses 1 to 14 was being fulfilled. He was being exalted, not by wealth or power, but by the ability to make a difference in others' lives. His journey of faith and obedience to God's commandments had led him to a place of honor and respect, a living testimony to divine faithfulness. With his renewed purpose and transformed life, the man began to see the impact of his actions on the community. He not only helped those in need but also inspired others to do the same. His story of overcoming and service spread, and he became a respected and admired figure. People from different parts came to him for advice and support. He never refused help to anyone, remembering his own struggles and how faith and the kindness of strangers had changed his life. Each act of kindness he performed was an expression of his gratitude to God and a fulfillment of the promise of Deuteronomy 28 verses 1 to 14. And so, the man began to be recognized and exalted in his community. He was invited to speak at events, share his testimony in churches, and even participate in local radio programs. His voice, once suffocated by despair, now resonated as a beacon of hope and faith. The exaltation, however, did not change his humility. He knew that all the blessings received were the result of his obedience and faith in God. He continued to serve with the same dedication and love, always grateful for the opportunities to make a difference. He saw his exaltation as a greater responsibility to continue helping and inspiring others. It was during one of these moments of recognition that he encountered a family in great need. He remembered his own difficulties and dedicated himself to helping them get back on their feet. The gratitude in their eyes and the transformation he witnessed reaffirmed his purpose and the veracity of the divine promise. This phase of his life was marked by a continuous cycle of giving and receiving. The more he gave of himself, the more he received in terms of love, respect, and blessings. God's promise was being fulfilled in deep and tangible ways, bringing a fulfillment that went beyond the material. The man, who had once been abandoned and lost, was now living a life full of purpose and meaning. He was a living testimony to God's faithfulness, proof that listening and following the Lord's voice truly leads to exaltation and blessing. His journey was far from over, but he was ready for any challenge, knowing that God was always by his side. With each step of his journey, the man continued to be a light in the lives of many. His story of overcoming was not just about him, but about the manifestation of the divine promise for all who chose to listen and follow God's voice. He was living a life of peace and fulfillment that once seemed impossible. In a moment of reflection, he looked back and saw the long road he had traveled. He remembered the dark days of abandonment and despair, the lonely nights and feelings of failure. Now, those moments were just memories of a life transformed by God's grace and mercy. The promise of Deuteronomy 28 verses 1 to 14 had been fulfilled in ways he could never have imagined. He not only found the promised exaltation and blessings, but also became a source of blessings for others. His life was a living testimony to the power of faith and obedience. In one of his last public speeches, he shared this reflection: "I know many of you face difficulties that seem insurmountable. I too have been there, at the bottom, without hope. But I can say with all certainty that God does not abandon us. He guides us, strengthens us, and blesses us in ways we do not always understand at the moment. Follow his commandments, listen to his voice, and you will see that the promise of blessing is real and powerful." He concluded by saying, "My journey continues, and I know many challenges still lie ahead. But I am ready because I know that God is with me. And I know he is with each of you as well." The life of that man, once marked by pain and abandonment, was now a testimony of hope, faith, and transformation. He had found the peace he had long sought and a purpose that gave meaning to each day. The community around him flourished, inspired by his example and the divine promise he lived. And so, the story of that man, which began with so much suffering, turned into a shining example of God's promise. He taught everyone that, regardless of adversity, there is always hope and light ahead. The promise of exaltation and blessing was within everyone's reach. It was enough to listen to the Lord's voice and follow his commandments. If you liked this short story, comment and share so that YouTube can distribute it to more people. See you soon.